Thank you for joining us today for this joint RenWeb Firestorm webinar. We're pleased to have you with us. All participants today are on mute. Should you have any questions that occur during the webinar, please feel free to use the question facility built in to GoToWebinar. We will also give you an opportunity. We'll contact you after the webinar and see if you have any questions that have arisen. Firestorm is pleased to be with us today, and Harry, if you could move that first slide, we'll be underway. There we go. We will be following this. The hashtag on Twitter is #CrisisCoach. Firestorm does have a Facebook site, which we invite you to come and be our friend. We also have firestorm.com, which is our main website, and you can get a lot of information there. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. We empower you, the individual, the user, the organization, to manage risks and crises. Firestorm has expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and in consequence management, among other things. As always, our attorneys make us present this one. This presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The work product provided today by Firestorm must be read in conjunction with local guidance given by national, regional, local authorities, as well as your company's, your school's personal counsel. Moreover, this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're pleased to have RenWeb as our co-sponsor and underwriter of this series. This is the Crisis Coach series. Today we're discussing Next We Plan. On our next time, about a month from now, we'll be talking about why, what, and how do you test. You may review past webinars at firestorm.com. You can register for future webinars also on firestorm.com. We're pleased to have Wendell Phipps with us. Wendell is in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and he's the moderator. And Wendell, turn it over to you for a minute here.
Yes, hello everyone. We're glad to have you joining this seminar, this webinar with us. RenWeb is very happy to co-sponsor this, especially in light of the things that have happened just even in this past week. RenWeb has been around for quite some time, and we continue to grow on the fact that we allow you as a school to manage all of your data, all of the aspects of your school in one database in a powerful, easy to use, and very affordable aspect. So for sure, as you listen to this Firestorm webinar today, and as you're thinking about RenWeb, know that we have other things built into our program to allow you to protect your families, to have great communication with your families, so that in every aspect, as best as possible, we're doing our best for your students and your children to be safe while they're in our institutions. So we hope that if you have any questions about RenWeb, that you will contact us as well or ask them at some point in our webinar today. So thank you again for joining this webinar that we have co-sponsored, and we will continue on with Harry now.
Good. And we'll now introduce Firestorm's Chief Executive Officer, Harry Rhulen. Harry?
Well, thank you, Wendell and Bill. I'm really looking forward to today's presentation because, as Wendell indicated, there's been a lot going on in the school world these past couple of weeks. One of the things that Wendell just mentioned that I want to emphasize, and you'll hear me talk more about both in this webinar but going forward, is the idea that RenWeb can help you in terms of communications. Communications are essential during any kind of a crisis. They're essential during peacetime as well. But being able to communicate clearly and effectively with all of your school constituents is extremely important. I think RenWeb gives you some great tools for doing that. Before we start, one of the things I'd like to do, we always try and do an update for everybody as to what's been going on that affect schools and affect you as individuals as well. I think everybody's been seeing on the news the number of school shootings and the number of school violent events has really gone a little bit off the chart the last couple of weeks. Prior to getting on the webinar, Bill Wendell and I were discussing the fact that in the first 3 years, and we're not even done with the third year yet of this decade, we have already now had more school shootings than in any previous decade in total. So we have had close to 40 school shootings or school-related mass violence events in the, from 2010 to 2013 than we had in any previous decade, the largest one previously being 31 events. There is a change. There is a cultural change in our society where violence is being brought to our schools. In speaking with clinical psychiatrists and psychologists, one of the things that they're pointing to is the change in the way that our children receive information, the continuous media blast that they get over their smartphones, on their computers, on their tablets, on the television. They receive information in a completely different way, and they process it differently. And unfortunately, it's resulting in very negative outcomes for schools. Now, the good part about that is we as school safety people and you as administrators of schools have the ability to monitor and control media and social media so that you can predict things that may occur. And therefore, if you've got appropriate planning in place, if you've got social media monitoring, if you have different type of metrics set up for monitoring exposures, behavioral issues, you have the ability to intervene. And that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about on today's webinar, because really what we want is to help create an environment where we're preventing these things from ever occurring, as opposed to trying to respond to an active shooter or a violent event in our school. One of the ways that I like to portray it when I'm talking to you, and I've had the opportunity to talk to many of you on the phone this week in doing the assessments which are being sponsored by RenWeb. One of the things we talk about on each one of those calls is the difference between a Secret Service type of approach and a police approach. The police are called after something has already occurred. They're very response-oriented. Whereas the Secret Service, if they ever have to pull out their gun or they ever have to protect the president, they view it as a failure. They want to prevent whatever it is from ever having occurred. They never want to put the president in harm's way. Similarly, that's what you want to do at your schools. You want to make sure that the kids, your faculty, your staff, that no one is ever in harm's way. And there are ways through planning, through doing your predictive work, the planning and the training and the education, that you can significantly reduce those exposures. So going to that issue, talking about, why do we plan, why do we measure and put in place these metrics, you want to make sure, and you see on this particular slide that the word you or your is underlined everywhere. There's a reason for that, and that's because the individual is the one that has the ability to make a difference. You have the ability to make a difference in your planning process, in understanding the exposures that your school has, and realistically, when we talk about a crisis, it's the one that happens to you that really is going to determine how you feel about it. I mean, obviously, for example, we just had very severe flooding out here in Colorado, and the damage and the impact from that is still being felt every day. But because it's no longer in the news, for the most part, the nation has forgotten about it. The only people who haven't is the people who it happened to. And that's why that word you and your become very important in this whole process. So in going through the different aspects of planning, we definitely want to talk to you about how your plans align with best practices. We want you to understand where your gaps are. We want you to look at whether or not your critical supply chain, the suppliers that you rely on, have been looked at. because we've had schools in the recent weeks that have been closed for various reasons, one of which their water supply was shut off, and the health department said you can't run a school without water. And that was because the pumps that supplied the school, there was an electrical problem. We also had a school that had an IT-related issue that prevented them from running any of their smart boards or any of the other things, and they actually had to revert back to a non-technologically oriented type of teaching methodology, which they were, well, obviously they did, but they weren't prepared for because they hadn't thought through the fact that they could lose that IT capability. So again, when you're doing your vulnerability and threat analysis across the board, it's important to remember that things like active shooter, while they have to be planned for because there's an expectation, the likelihood of their occurrence is far less than some of the other things that we also want to make sure we plan for. You know, so you might look at that situation I just mentioned with not having access to IT and think, well, that's no big deal. Well, it's no big deal until you have to interact with the media and parents and others who are asking very difficult questions. And if you haven't put in place a communications plan, if you don't have a media-trained individual on your staff, some of those things can turn into a crisis of their own, with that, even though the incident itself is fairly innocuous. So we'll talk more about those kind of things as we go on. Knowing what type of things you should be looking at, what should you be measuring, obviously setting goals for your program, knowing what the concerns are about the constituents that you deal with. You know, what are parents concerned about? What are the kids concerned about? One of the things that's happening a lot now as a result of the press having such tremendous coverage on issues of school violence is that schools are being asked to demonstrate their preparedness. That parents want to see and understand the plan. And you need to be able to respond to them in a very definitive manner. And that's another thing that we very much can help you with and that we want to talk to you about. So please don't hesitate to reach out, you know, in any way where we can help you develop the messages that you're going to give to the various constituents that are going to ask you these type of questions. One of the things that RenWeb is bringing to the table for all of you, which is tremendously valuable, and we've been doing a lot of assessments for RenWeb schools, is this the preparedness self-assessment. We've got a program in place where we will talk you through, it takes about an hour to go through, and we walk you through a series of questions which will enlighten us as to how your school works. It will also give you a lot of information about areas you should be working on, areas you should be looking at. Bring questions up which you may want to ask of your board or of your management team. Tell you how you might want to think about interacting with your students, your faculty, your staff on various issues that affect safety, security, preparedness. You know, this is something that Firestorm normally does for a charge, but RenWeb has brought this to all of you as a value-added service that you're not going to be paying for. So I think any school that would like to take advantage of this, you know, please do, and you can access that through RenWeb or directly through Firestorm. So the areas of focus in your planning process that we want you to look at, the program framework. You've got to have an overarching preparedness framework within your school before you can start looking at all the different things that have to go into it. The risk assessment is the first piece. You know, sitting down with your staff and knowing what the vulnerabilities and threats are so that you can then begin to build a plan. every day as a result of workplace violence. If the shooter in your school happens to be an employee or the spouse or boyfriend of an employee, which happens very regularly in the United States, it's not going to matter from a standpoint of the brand and reputation of your school. So it's important to be doing both school violence prevention and workplace violence prevention at the same time. Your security plan is an essential piece of the overall puzzle. And I say security plan because I know a lot of schools have in place cameras and locks and guards and other things that are tools that can be used to create a plan, but very often they're being used on a standalone basis. There's no integration with communications and other things so that everyone knows what their roles and responsibilities are and how those various tools fit into the overall structure. So planning is essential on the security side. Human resources, I can tell you that from a workplace violence standpoint, hiring, firing, and discipline are the things that create the biggest problems with employees and workplace violence. So I think most of you probably know we have had violence against school administrators as a result of hirings and firings, and in certain cases those have resulted in death. So there's a lot of work that we can do with you in terms of analyzing your human resource policies, your approach and the consistency of your approach to disciplining, to doing annual reviews, to handling employees in general. Every school needs to have an emergency response plan. The notification piece, as I indicated earlier, RenWeb can be very helpful with. RenWeb has parent notification systems and other things built into their software that can be very useful as part of your overall preparedness and crisis communications process. Crisis communications are essential. One of the things that we ask schools to differentiate is the emergency response, which is life safety oriented, from everything that occurs after that. Because after the emergency is over, there's still a tremendous amount of communication that needs to take place. So all of these pieces, as I just indicated, are part of the planning process which you're going to go through for your school preparedness plan. It needs to have been endorsed by your governing body, whether that's your board of trustees, or I know a lot of the faith-based organizations operate through their diocese or whoever the controlling entity is in their particular geographic area. One of the ones we haven't talked about that's on the bottom of this list is the reunification plan. That's part of your evacuation strategy, and very few schools have looked at that piece. So I'll talk more about that as we go on in the presentation. One of the things we get asked on a regular basis, well, what's in an emergency response plan? What you see on your screen right now is the table of contents from one school's emergency response plan. These are the things that they felt were essential to their school. Now keep in mind, your school may have a completely different list. You know, if you're exposed, for example, if you're in the tornado belt, you know, you may have put that very high up on your list. Or some of the schools out here in the Southwest have snake bite, rattlesnakes on their campuses. You know, that's included in their emergency response plan. What you put in your hazard and threat list is going to come from the vulnerability analysis that you're going to do with your staff. Very often it's helpful to have that particular meeting in some way facilitated by someone who can help you develop that list and prioritize that list. But it's essential that it be done as part of your process. One of the things I've learned from a lot of you over the course of the past several weeks doing these assessments is that a lot of you have plans that tell people what to do. You tell them that in the event of a particular occurrence, there's something that they must do. But what you don't tell them is how to do it. So interestingly, I had a situation just recently where one of you told me about your emergency response plan told people to dial 911 in the event of a certain type of occurrence, and that you had a temp who was working at the front desk when one of these things occurred. Unfortunately, because the plan just said to dial 911, but it didn't really tell the person how to do it, this individual picked up the phone and dialed 911 and waited for an answer. Unfortunately, she waited for quite a while because their school system required her to dial 9 to get an outside line and then dial 911. And because she was in a fairly, I don't want to say panic, but a serious situation, her brain wasn't thinking clearly, and she didn't understand why she couldn't get through. So she hung up and dialed 911 again and still didn't get through. One of the things you need to understand and assume is that the individual who might need to utilize the plan is operating at a substandard level because of the crisis. And they need to know exactly how to do it, not just what to do. So we can talk more about that. You know, for example, some of the tornado plans. You know, some of the school's tornado plans say when you hear the weather siren, seek shelter. That is not adequate. It needs to say where they're going to seek shelter, how they're going to do it, what, if you're in a specific location, where that shelter is, and who's responsible for doing what. The plans need to be very detailed, because then what we're able to do is take that plan and train and educate. And then once we've trained and educated, we can do the test exercises to make sure that in fact it works. So the kind of response protocols are essential. Everyone needs to know what they're going to do during an emergency or a crisis. You know, some plans between different types of occurrences. So for example, your shelter in place for a lightning-related event may be very different than your shelter in place for a tornado event. Obviously, being indoors for a lightning or thunderstorm in almost any school building is going to be adequate. But certain school buildings may not be adequate in a tornado-related event. You may only have one tornado-safe building on your property. So we need to be very careful in developing our planning and then in our training and educating process so that people understand the difference between the types of vulnerabilities and threats that the school might face. This particular slide, what you'll see in front of you, is a medical-related slide for providing first aid to injured members of your school. Now what you'll see, a lot of this is actually written as a camp-related slide. A lot of our schools that we do work with, especially our private schools, our independent schools, have camps that are run on their property during the summer, during Christmas season, during spring break, other things, where the camp management is actually in control of the campus. Those situations are very important for you to focus on because they need as much or more guidance than your day-to-day staff. They need the training and the education. They need to know exactly what to do in the event that something occurs on your campus. Similarly, this same type of medical approach needs to be included in your emergency response plan and procedures. Your faculty, your staff during the normal school year need that education as well. Your security plan. I think everybody understands that security is a very complex mix of many, many things. And there's, you know, the visitor policies, the non-custodial parent policies, anonymous reporting capabilities, all kinds of things mixed together, but the essential piece is that they be integrated into one plan. Again, if these are all disparate pieces and people don't understand how they work in concert together to create safety and security, there will be holes, there will be gaps, there will be things that are missed that result in far greater exposure to your community. So developing comprehensive integrated plans is essential for every school. You know, I mentioned anonymous reporting. It's one of the most critical things that can help you in doing, as I indicated earlier, what the Secret Service does, in avoiding problems to begin with. If your students and faculty know how to report something where they're not worried about any kind of retribution or anything else, that is a huge advantage to your school, because invariably someone knows that something is going on. Actually, when we talk about school violence, the police have said that about 80% of cases, at least one person knew that something was going to happen. They call it leakage. And in about 66% of the cases, 2 or more people knew. If those people know how to report and they know that it's not going to come back against them, they are more likely to do it. Now, some of the schools that we work with, especially here in Colorado, have a huge advantage. We have a system called Safe to Tell that was created by the Attorney General's office, and it is a completely anonymous reporting system, text message, email, or telephone. But I spoke with a school yesterday who actually has a system that's working well for them, which is a suggestion box. That suggestion box, students can drop anything they want in it. And they have, as part of their culture, they've educated everyone to the fact that no one will ever try to determine who dropped that note in the box. And you can drop a note in the box that says, hey, I want grape juice in the cafeteria, or you can drop a note in the box that says, hey, Mr. Smith, the soccer coach, is making inappropriate comments to the players. You know, it could be almost anything, but having an anonymous capability is hugely important. It's also important because it helps create the culture that you want at your school. You want everyone from a security standpoint to know that they are responsible for one another and that taking care of one another is an important part of your school culture. You see highlighted there law enforcement relationships. It is so important that the police, fire, and emergency medical within your community know what your plans are. It is absolutely almost mandatory that they participate in your test exercise process. So as you develop your plans, developing the communication strategy for letting them know when you're testing, when you're doing exercises, so that they can come and observe and participate, but also then when it becomes a real-life event, they understand and know what to expect. So those things are really critical, and you need to think about them as part of your overall planning process. Now, one of the things I want to also say is you guys have to remember, this whole process that I'm talking about, which can sound rather daunting, does not need to be done all at once. What we want to see is continuous improvement. We want to see that you guys are working every month on adding to your program, on improving your program, doing more training, doing more exercises, but it doesn't have to happen all at once. Right now you're on the calendar, you can schedule it, you can put it on for the second week of each month, you can determine who you're going to have meetings with, what you're going to do. That's what needs to happen. Trying to, you know, the old adage of trying to eat an elephant, you got to do it one bite at a time. Trying to eat the whole elephant at once is never going to work. So we need to make sure that we're moving forward at a metered pace. For some schools, that's going to mean, you know, teeny little things going on a monthly basis. Some schools have more capabilities, more money available, more people. You know, the smaller schools, I know you guys are all wearing multiple hats. You're trying to do, you know, so many things all at once. You may need more help from a project management standpoint than you even do from a planning standpoint. So make sure you're reaching out and getting that kind of assistance. Make sure you've got the people within your school who support your efforts to do those kind of things, because that's the way you're going to make sure that it all happens and happens in a meaningful way. You know what, this physical security issue that you see up on your screen right now, a lot of you have been asking me about security personnel options, armed versus unarmed. You know, should we be thinking about arming teachers? Should we be thinking about arming guards? You know, all of those things can be tools as part of a overall security plan and strategy, but they are very, very big decisions. You know, you see some of the statistics at the bottom of the slide there. In studies that have been done with the New York City Police Department, you'll see that their hit rate during a gunfight actually fall to 18%. I would point out to you that those are trained officers who qualify at the range twice a year and receive continuing education on a regular basis. Think about where the other 82% of the bullets go, and think about that in your school environment. That's not to say we can't put guards in schools. That's not to say that there's not a plan that can be developed, but that plan would need to include tremendous amounts of training, testing, you know, qualification. It can be done, but it certainly cannot be done in an offhand type of manner. The biggest challenges to security at a school, without question, is your visitor policy, your the way in which you deal with restraining orders, non-custodial parents, things of that nature. The other thing to remember is that insiders at your school know the gaps. So I was the person that got called by President Steger after the shootings at Virginia Tech to help come down and manage the crisis and media situation there. And people said to me, well, you know, there were lots of ways they could have prevented that from occurring, but what nobody really focused on was the fact that Cho was an insider. Even if you needed to have a name badge or some other type of thing to access the buildings, he would have had that because he was a student. So remember in your planning process, again, insiders are part of the problem, and if we can address those issues, if we know the behavioral warning signs, if we know how to cut those things off before they actually happen, that's our goal. Yes, we need to have a response capability, but focusing on response is not what we want to do. We want to focus on prevention. The things that we really encourage everybody to look at is having documented procedures for what you do with various types of threats. You know, so for example, in almost every state, child sex abuse reporting, reporting various types of violent related events, that's actually a mandated reporter requirement for many schools. Going back to the communications issues, I know a lot of schools have not documented their communications strategies and what the messages are, who's going to deliver those messages, who they need to be delivered to, and often in a crisis or emergency situation, different entities that need to be communicated with fall through the cracks. Also, statements might be made to a party that were, in hindsight, inappropriate statements to be made, or information which you might not have wanted that party to have. And again, that happens when there is not a detailed communications plan and strategy as part of your overall preparedness. So having that detail in place becomes critical to a successful outcome. You know, one of the things that we talk to schools about all the time when they ask about their active shooter response, you know, most schools in developing their plan have developed a plan for what they perceive is going to be a shooter walking through the front door, which is the most common, during their normal school hours where everybody is in class. Well, what you have to remember is sometimes there are kids outside in the playground. Sometimes they are doing various sports activities. Sometimes you have students both inside and outside. Sometimes the intruder is outside. There are so many aspects to your planning process, not just for active shooter, but for many vulnerabilities. You know, if you're talking about your tornado plan, the same thing applies. You can have students in various locations. We need to know, how are we notifying, how are we getting them inside, or how are we getting them to their designated locations. If the sports fields are too far from the main building, what's the strategy then? So again, the process, you guys, for your schools, you know the answers to all these questions. The problem is you don't necessarily think of the questions. So sitting down in a room with your people and doing the vulnerability and threat analysis, doing the detailed planning that's necessary, that's the only way you're going to make sure all of the risks are covered. And then, you go back to the crisis communications, the commands that are going to be given. Everyone needs to know what they are. They need to be clear. They need to be concise. And absolutely, you cannot have people formulating commands or formulating messaging during the crisis. I can guarantee you that that will result in a suboptimal response. Now, many of you implemented what is now called the Standard Response Protocol. The Standard Response Protocol was developed by the I Love You Guys Foundation, and you can all go to their website. It is free information available to every school. It was developed by the Keys family. John, Michael, and Ellen Keys run the I Love You Guys Foundation. I Love You Guys is the last text message that their daughter texted to them before she was killed in the Platte Canyon shooting. Emily Keys died that day, and her family has dedicated itself to school safety and security. So lockout, lockdown, evacuate, and shelter in place are now the terms of art that are used for all hazards response in schools. And when I tell a police organization or anyone else that my school is in lockdown, they know what that means. They know that means someone is inside my school and we have locked down the facility. Whereas if I tell them we're in lockout, that means there's something going on outside of our school that we are going to prevent from coming in. So understanding the words, understanding what the protocols are, and making sure our people know the difference is very important. It can be very confusing if we use language in our school that is different than the school down the street, which is different than what the rest of the nation might be doing. So I would encourage all of you to look at these response protocols and see if and how they fit into your overall planning process. One of the things that I love the Foundation website is they produce these kind of documents that they will make available to any school. For private schools, they ask that you make a small donation to their foundation. For public schools, most of this information is available, and the actual reproducible items are available free of charge. But as you can see, they not only tell you what to do, they tell you how to do it and what the messaging is. They even tell you that you need to say it twice. So again, I encourage all of you to go to that website and look at some of their information. One of the things I also encourage all of you to do in your planning process is look at your school. Doing a site assessment, walking around, can be very different than looking at it from above. This happens to be the independent school that I went to in Connecticut, and it is a very large campus. And as you can see, if we start talking about emergency response planning, depending on where you are in this picture at the time at which an emergency occurs, or there's some type of information that you want me to have as a student, faculty, staff member, you have to think very clearly about the modalities that you use for communicating. Because on a campus of this size, no one modality, not a cell phone, not a horn, not a PA system, is going to be adequate for reaching everyone that you might want to reach. So again, that all has to be incorporated into your thought process and into your planning process. So going back, that whole idea of communicating, crisis communications planning, how do you communicate during the crisis? Absolutely, RenWeb can help you with that. They can help you with communicating with parents and all kinds of outside constituents. But we have to look also at how do we communicate during the day with the people who are in our facility. Now, some of you I know are in single buildings. Some of you have campuses that are very spread out with multiple buildings. Some of you, because of your growth, have had to add modular classrooms that do not have the intercom system built in. So every school is different, and everyone must be analyzed from a standpoint of the vulnerabilities and threats that are particular to their enterprise. So we're happy to talk to you about that and work with you. So don't just assume because you got the emergency response plan from the school down the street that that's adequate for what you're doing. Certainly it can be modified, and what it ultimately comes down to, whether it's going to be successful or not and actionable, is whether you've done all of the pieces to make it so and done the training and the education, the test exercises to make it happen. One of the things that you'll see in a lot of plans is the documents which show who the contacts are, how to get in contact with them, and all of the supporting documentation. You know, one of the things, we actually were supposed to do an assessment with a school today we had to call off the assessment because the woman who we were going to be doing it with was hospitalized yesterday. When I do get the opportunity, and she's going to be fine, but when we do get the opportunity to speak with her, one of the points I'm going to make, and this is one of the points I think that's essential for all of you, is that you don't know who's going to be available at any given time during an emergency to implement your plan. So as part of your plan, you've got to have redundancy. You know, a person is on vacation or a person is not available. That can throw a serious monkey wrench into the works, especially if you have not documented your plan so that everyone understands, if I have to take over for you, exactly what I have to do, how I have to do it, who I have to contact. Those things are important because invariably Murphy's Law is working hard against you. The person you need is not going to be there. The other thing that I would point out to you from a standpoint of institutional knowledge, I met yesterday with the head of a school here in Colorado, and every answer he had was, oh yeah, I know that, I understand that, I know what to do in that situation. And I had to say to him, what's going to happen if you're not here? And I got a very blank stare. And I said, well, do you ever go out to lunch? Do you ever go on vacation? Are you ever sick? If something occurs during those times, we have to know who the backup is, and we need to know that the plan is going to work equally well with or without that person in place. As a matter of fact, I would encourage all of you during your test exercises to take certain key individuals out of the picture. Make them unavailable, because that is a great way to tell whether there are flaws within the plan, within the documentation, within the training. So make sure you implement that as part of your protocol. Again, similarly with your emergency communications, knowing who's allowed to use them, what they're allowed to say, making sure that everybody knows the signals and the assembly areas, it can be critical. Again, knowing who can use the different communication modalities and what they're allowed to say, what the triggers are. All of those things need to be documented very clearly, because otherwise, especially for those of you who are using walkie-talkies, what you wind up getting is so much chatter on the radio that they become completely ineffective. One of the things I do a lot of work with, and I've worked with some of you on, is your external communications, doing what we call media training, which now has become even more than just media training. It's social media training as well. I think one of the biggest developing risks for schools is the whole area of social media. Because our kids communicate that way almost exclusively, and because more and more the parents are using social media, you have to remember that everybody is a publisher. Everybody becomes a potential interviewer of you, because all they need is their cell phone, they videotape you, and they put it out on YouTube. So you have to assume that any question that you're getting asked has the potential to be out in the media and out in the public space almost instantaneously. So you need to make sure that you've been trained, that you know what your messages are, and that you know how to communicate them clearly. Because if you make a statement that is not 100% factually correct, it can and most likely will come back to haunt you. So making sure you've identified your spokespeople, that they've received the training, that that's part of your planning process, that you've got the backup so that you know who's going to take those questions or answer those questions in the event that the primary person is not there. All of those become essential parts of your planning. About message mapping in the media environment, but also just in terms of overall crisis communications, we have what we call home bases. There are certain answers to certain questions that you just need to know intuitively. If you're going to be the one out there talking to any constituent, whether it be parents, the press, your regulators, you need to know how to answer if you get asked a question that you're not particularly comfortable with. So in the situation with Virginia Tech, we developed certain home bases, such as we are not going to be defined by this event. You know, when the press would ask a question, you know, like, you know, isn't this going to destroy the value of the people, the alumni? Doesn't it make their education here less valuable because of what occurred today? You know, one of the home bases we had was, we are not going to be defined by this event. We are not going to allow this event to change the value of this organization. And having those kind of pre-established home bases makes it so that you're not searching for explanations or answers. And it's very critical, because if you've never been involved in crisis communications, if you've never had to answer questions on the spot, it's an unusual experience, and it's one where we would certainly like to put you in that situation in a test environment so that you can see what it looks like and what it feels like, because then you will be better prepared to deal with it if for any reason you ever have to. So this is an actual example of some message maps that were put together for some schools. So you can see in the key messages, we will not be defined by this event. We are proud of our 40-year tradition and child-centered philosophy and are committed to a safe learning environment. Well, if you've got that kind of home base memorized in your mind, and in fact, if you're doing telephone interviews or anything else, a lot of our clients choose to keep these messages right in front of them. But if you can formulate your answers utilizing those home bases, you're going to feel much more comfortable. You're going to be much less nervous, and therefore you're going to be far less likely to make statements which you wish you hadn't made. You probably all remember the guy, the CEO, who was the president of British Petroleum, of BP, who on national and international television said that he just wanted his life back. He just wanted to go home. He has lived to regret that statement ever since that day. So we want to help you not make those kind of statements which affect your credibility personally, and also that affect the reputation and brand of your school. Maps can be generated for every constituent, whether they be parents, regulators, or anyone else within your organization. You know, I mentioned earlier having a reunification plan and that not many schools have it. That's why this slide is blank, because this is the typical reunification plan for the schools that we've been dealing with. What a reunification plan is when you have to evacuate your school, you know, there's been a gas main leak or there's been something else where you have to remove the kids from your school. Knowing how you're going to communicate with your parents, knowing where they're going to pick up their kids, making sure that you've taken with you the book that says who's allowed to pick up which kids, who are the actual parents for that child, all of those things become critical to make sure that the reunification happens in an appropriate fashion. Because keep in mind, one of the ways that a non-custodial parent is going to look to get access to their child is by forcing, either through a bomb threat call or some other methodology, an evacuation of your campus or an evacuation of your school. So again, these are things we need to incorporate into the process when we're doing our planning. So with that, I've used about 50 minutes of all of your time. I certainly open the floor and welcome any questions that you might have. Bill, do you have any questions that have been submitted?
Have to get myself
Bill,
off.
Are you there?
Yeah, had to get off mute first.
Yeah, I figured you were on mute.
Okay. Hey, if you have any questions, now is the time to type them in. One question: how can you plan to secure bus loading and unloading areas before and after school time?
Well, that's an interesting question, of course. Every school is different, so I can't answer that generically, but what I can tell you, some schools, for example, have one entrance where the buses come in and a separate entrance where the buses leave their particular one. So controlling those access points, whether it's by having a staff member who stands at the entrance with a walkie-talkie, or there's any number of methodologies. Now, schools that are loading at the curb of the street, they have a completely different exposure because, of course, they have cars going by at the same time that their buses are loading. There are plans that can be developed around each of those different processes, but it's difficult to answer, generically. Again, you can use staff. If you're in an urban environment, very often the police department will be willing to provide a squad car or an on-foot officer who can participate in that process. It really, again, depends on the vulnerability and the exposure that you perceive. One of the schools that we work with has a multi-tiered parking lot, so they only allow parents pickup in the upper lot. They don't allow parent cars to come down and interact on the lower level with the buses. Again, it's impossible for me to answer generically, but there's no question that a plan can be developed. And that's, I think, that holds true for not just this particular question, but for almost any vulnerability or threat that you have. If you know what it is you're trying to address, there are people and, in some cases, experts that can be brought in to assist in addressing those situations.
Thank you, Harry. Well, no one has typed in any questions.
Okay, well, one of the things I would like to very much thank RenWeb for participating and making these webinars happen. I want to re-emphasize to everybody that RenWeb has enabled you to receive the self-assessment that we're doing, which on average for a school is about a $2,500 value, a little more or a little less depending on the size of the school. But I would encourage all of you to take advantage of it. When I have these conversations with schools and we're going through the self-assessment, I learn some great things from all of you. I would be surprised if any of the schools that have gone through this have not picked up some very valuable information for their planning process in going through it. So I would very much urge all of you to do that. And again, you can reach out to RenWeb directly, and they can help you get that set up. Feel free to reach out to Firestorm, and I know Bill or any of the folks at Firestorm would be more than happy to get that set up for you. I also encourage you to participate in the RenWeb series as we go through it. The Crisis Coach webinars we're doing, the next one we're going to talk about is, how do you, in fact, once you've done your planning, how do you set up your test exercises? Keep in mind, you won't know whether your planning efforts have been effective till you've had an opportunity to test them. You definitely don't want to test them in a live crisis environment. So we want to talk to you a bit about how you're going to do that. As you can see on your screen, there is an email address you can certainly send email to. If you want to call the 800 number to set up a self-assessment, please feel free to do that. And we are available 24/7. Do not hesitate to contact us. If you have any kind of a situation emerging or an emergency or a question, again, prevention is all of our goals. We want to make sure that our schools are safe. Call early and deal with the questions as they come up. Don't wait for things to develop. We are available to you. So with that, I would say, Bill, we're done with today's webinar. And Wendell, I want to thank you very much for participating. Wendell, did you have any closing comments from a RenWeb standpoint?
No, I think what you've said is excellent. Just if anybody's interested in hearing how RenWeb can also assist in the communications to their families besides running the school, please feel free to contact us on that as well.
Yeah, I very much encourage everybody to contact RenWeb and talk not just about the way that their software helps you run the school, but how that it can help your school both in peacetime but also in crisis situations, because keeping your families calm and instilling confidence in them has a lot to do with communication. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to the next RenWeb webinar in about a month or so.
Thank you, Harry.
Have a great day, everyone.
Yep, bye-bye.